So I am delighted to welcome you all to the 29th annual meeting of the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. I'm Ron Mangan from the Center for Mind and Brain at University of California, Davis, and I welcome you today on behalf of the Society's governing board and the members of the many committees responsible for today's event. It's been 3 years since our last in-person meeting in 2019, and it is wonderful to see you back. And if that doesn't deserve applause, I don't know what does. Somebody give those people that hooted extra drink cards. So we know that for many early career scientists in the audience, this is your first in-person scientific meeting, and we're all delighted that you're here. As always, though, we keep in our hearts those worldwide that have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and remember those who couldn't be with us this year, but look forward to seeing them in the future. So some quick thanks. First, thanks to the committee chairs and members, which by my count is over 50 people were working on this meeting in different capacities. Thanks to the CNS staff and volunteers, and also to TM Events for their hard work. Thanks to our many partners, shown on this slide. Your support is greatly appreciated. And this year, we want to acknowledge a new sponsor program. The Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience has created the JOCN Travel Fellowships, and wherever Brad Postal is, that's well done, Brad. So some events of interest. Just point these out, get them on your calendars. On Sunday, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Workshop, the 7th Annual CNS Trainee Association Professional Development Panel for Trainees is on Monday, and then after that, the CNS Trainee Association is hosting a social night. And then the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience is going to have a discussion titled, What's New and What Should Be Next? Finally, the CNS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee will be hosting a DEI meet and greet coffee hour on Sunday at 3:30 p.m. in the Grand Ballroom foyer. The members of the committee asked that I show this slide so that you would know who to look for, because they actually really want to talk with you. They want you to come find them. So memorize these faces. Now, it's my true pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. She studied experimental psychology at Oxford University and took her PhD at University College London, working in the Functional Imaging Lab, the PHIL, with Professors Chris Frith and Daniel Wolpert. This was followed by several fellowships, that section was too long to say, where she developed her focus on developmental cognitive neuroscience, becoming a group leader eventually at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College, and then in 2019 took up a chair in psychology at Cambridge. Now at Cambridge, Professor Blakemore leads the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Group, which focuses on the development of social cognition and decision-making in the adolescent brain. Her research involves behavioral studies in the lab and out in schools, and she also conducts neuroimaging studies in adolescents and young adults. Professor Blakemore was the founding editor-in-chief of the highly respected and popular journal Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, and she served in that role until 2019. She's not only a leading scholar, but also a popular scientific author and speaker, and a dedicated public servant in the interests of science and science education. With Professor Uta Frith, she wrote The Learning Brain, Lessons for Education. And more recently, she penned Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain, published in 2018. And I can tell you, as a parent, I bought that book immediately. For the latter, for that book, she was awarded the Royal Society Book Prize in 2018, the Hay Festival Book of the Year, 2018, and the British Psychological Society Book Prize in 2020. Professor Blakemore has served on several key committees of the Royal Society, where she's very active, and is a member of the Times Education Commission. Among other venues, she's spoken about science and science education in programming for BBC Radio and at the TED Talks. Among other awards, Professor Blakemore received the annual Lecture Award by the Swedish Neuropsychological Society in 2011, the Royal Society Rosalind Franklin Award in 2013, the Klaus Jacobs Prize in 2015, the British Psychological Society President's Award in 2018, and the International Union of Psychological Science Quadrennial Major Advancement in Psychological Science Prize. She is a Fellow of the British Academy, of the Royal Society of Biology, and the Association for Psychological Science in the U.S. Please help me welcome Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore.
Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you, Ron, for such a kind introduction. This is my first in-person keynote at a conference for at least 2 years, I think more like 2.5 years, and it's just so nice to be back and to see colleagues face-to-face, not on Zoom, for the first time in a very long time. I've almost forgotten what it feels like. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, about the development of the social brain in adolescence and the effects of social distancing. So like Ron said, I did my PhD in London, and that PhD was on schizophrenia. I worked on schizophrenia both in my PhD and also in a postdoc in France. And it was during that time that I became really interested in the fact that all the patients I was testing in both London and in France, when I asked them the simple question, when did you start experiencing your symptoms, like hearing voices and being really paranoid, there wasn't a single exception. All the hundreds of patients I tested said at some age between about 18 and 26 years old. I became really interested in why this is. What is it about teenage brains of people who go on to develop schizophrenia that is different from people who don't go on to develop schizophrenia? At that point, that was in the early 2000s that I became interested in that question. Very little was known about teenage brain development. There are a couple of papers, very prominent papers, but not much more than that. So at that point in the early 2000s, I changed the focus of my own research, and since then I have been running a lab that works on the development of teenage or adolescent brain and behavior, and more latterly, mental health. Now, it's not just schizophrenia. Many mental health problems start at some point in adolescence. It's been estimated that 75% of mental illness first appears before the age of 24 years and 50% before the age of 15. I'm going to give you one other example of that. So I've already mentioned schizophrenia. This is a graph showing the age of first onset of depression. So what you can see on the x-axis is age, like the whole lifespan, and the first age of onset of depression peaks during adolescence. If you're someone who's unlucky enough to experience depression, it's very likely that you will first experience it during adolescence. So adolescence we usually define as the period of life between childhood and adulthood. More recently, it's defined as this period here, 10 to 24 years. So adolescence is a unique period of biological, psychological, and social development. It's also a period where we develop our sense of self-identity, and I'm going to give you a very nice illustration of that. So this is a letter that was written to the Guardian newspaper quite a long time ago now. So this is a reader who's describing her teenage diaries. So she says, there's nothing like teenage diaries for putting momentous historical events in perspective. This is my entry for the 20th of July, 1969. I went to art centre by myself in yellow cords and blouse. Ian was there, but he didn't speak to me. Got rhyme put in my handbag from someone who's apparently got a crush on me. It's Nicholas, I think. Man landed on moon. So what this diary extract illustrates is what's important to this particular teenage girl at this moment in her life. Less important is the fact that man happened to land on the moon that day. for the first time, and more important to things like what she's wearing, who she likes, who she doesn't like. Adolescence is the period of life in which we develop, or at least our sense of self and self-identity undergoes really profound development, profound transition. And particularly our sense of social self-identity, that is how other people see us. It's when we start to really care about how we are seen by other people, in particular our peers, and really that's going to be the theme of my talk today. Now you might be thinking, well, those characteristics of adolescence, that's a kind of recent phenomenon, I don't know, created in the last 100 years or so. But that's not quite true. In fact, adolescence and the kind of stereotypical behaviours that we associate with this age group there's nothing recent about them at all. If you look back at historical descriptions of adolescence, you see striking similarities with the way we stereotypically describe adolescence today. So, for example, going as far back as Socrates, so this is over 2,000 years ago, Socrates writes a lot about what he calls youth, and he says lots of negative things about youth, like here, he says, they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in the place of exercise. He was pretty negative about young people, as was Aristotle. He also wrote a lot about youth, and he said things like they're passionate, irascible, apt to be carried away by their impulses. This is the age when people are most devoted to their friends. And I've highlighted that sentence because, again, that's really the theme of this talk. So there's nothing new about these stereotypical behaviours that we immediately associate with youth, young people, adolescents. They've been around throughout history, these stereotypes. But what is new is our understanding of the development of the brain in adolescence. So when I was an undergraduate, 25 or so years ago, I was taught that the human brain stops developing in childhood. I remember being taught that in my developmental neuroscience lectures, and I also kept my textbooks from my undergraduate degree, and I'll just show you one example of that. So this is a neuroscience textbook from 1995. It's talking about myelination, which, as you know, is a really important neurodevelopmental process. And it says, it's one of the later stages of maturation, beginning usually late in embryonic life or early in postnatal life after the projection neurons are well in place, and continuing for considerable periods of time. And then in brackets it says into childhood in the case of humans. That was just in 1995, but we now know from the last 20 or 25 years of neuroimaging studies that that's not the case at all. In fact, myelination and a whole bunch of other neurodevelopmental processes continue right throughout childhood, right throughout adolescence, and even into the 20s and 30s. We know that because we're now able to scan the living human brain mostly using MRI scanning. And those studies, as I will come to in the next section, have shown in many, many times that the human brain undergoes really substantial and protracted development, particularly throughout adolescence. Not only throughout adolescence, of course, childhood is also a period of great development as well. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the development of the social brain, and what I mean by that is the network of brain regions that we use to understand other people's minds. In other words, the network of brain regions we use to mentalize, to do theory of mind. I was wondering how to illustrate or how to describe mentalizing, and I thought the best way to do this is show you a video. So this is a video that is quite old now, recorded by Tomasello's group. This is a paper they had in Science in 2006, where they were looking at mentalizing in very young children. Up until the early 2000s, it was assumed that until about 4 or 5, young children were not able to understand other people's mental states. They weren't able to infer mental states in others. They weren't able to mentalize in a sophisticated way. And this was one of the first studies, there are many more now, showing that, in fact, the ability to mentalize probably develops much earlier than 4 or 5. So in this study, which I'm going to show you in a second, they invited parents to bring their 18-month-old toddlers to the lab, and they recorded them in the waiting room. They didn't give them any instructions. I'll just play the video, one of the videos.
Oh. Oh.
And look at the eye contact. So what the authors claimed this showed was this spontaneous helping behavior in 18-month-olds must have been due to mentalizing. The 18-month-old saw that the man couldn't put intended to put the books in the bookshelf, but couldn't because his hands were full, and that's what elicited that spontaneous helping behavior, the inference of mental states in the adult, the inference of intentions. And there's a whole realm of lots of really nice research showing mentalizing abilities in even younger children, pre-verbal infants as well. But we're more interested in the other end of the developmental spectrum in adolescence, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. And I'm going to talk about how the social brain network develops in adolescence. So the social brain network, like I said, is activated whenever you think about other people's minds, whenever you do any kind of mentalizing task in a scanner. Invariably, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies now in adults showing that these 4 regions are the core network for mentalizing: the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, the posterior superior temporal cortex, and the anterior temporal cortex down here. What we're really interested in is how these regions develop during adolescence, and we've done a variety of different functional imaging studies looking at that, and also some structural imaging studies, and that's what I'm going to focus on today, our structural studies. So in this study, we looked at how grey matter volume develops in that social brain network that I just showed you. This was a study that was led by my former PhD student, Kate Mills. Kate is now, some of you may know Kate, she's a very successful developmental neuroscientist at the University of Oregon. She's assistant professor there. In this study, during her PhD, which she did in London, she analysed data from 288 participants, about half of whom were female, half male. They were aged between 7 and 30 when they went through their MRI scanning, and each participant was scanned multiple times. So this was a longitudinal study. Each participant was scanned at least twice every couple of years as they grew up. And we focused on these 4 regions that I've just told you. The regions of interest were defined by their activation in previous adult fMRI studies of mentalizing. Okay, so I'm going to show you how those regions developed in terms of grey matter volume by showing you these graphs. So what you can see here is the grey matter volume on the y-axis plotted against age in years on the x-axis. Remember that the participants were aged between 7 and 30 years. At the time they were scanned. Each of these regions shows a very similar pattern of grey matter development during this period of life. Each region shows, a cubic is the best fit in terms of the trajectory of the line. Grey matter is highest in late childhood and then declines very substantially during adolescence. And that's what you can see in each region. What you can see, although it might be quite small, is a number on the y-axis. That number, percentage, corresponds to the percentage decline in grey matter volume from the peak in late childhood to the trough in the early 20s. So, for example, in the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, there's a 17% decrease in grey matter from the highest point to the lowest point. And that's the same for all of these 4 regions. The amount of the decrease is slightly different in each region, but the overall pattern is very similar between regions. Now, you might be wondering whether this is just the social brain network that shows these changes in grey matter volume across adolescence. And no, it's not. There's nothing really very special about the social brain in terms of its grey matter development, and I'm going to illustrate that now. This is another series of studies that was led by Kate Mills and also our collaborator, Christian Tamnes, who's in Oslo. This looked at structural brain development across the whole brain in 4 different cohorts. So they analysed data from the NIMH cohort, the Pittsburgh cohort, a cohort in Leiden in the Netherlands, and a cohort in Oslo in Norway. Altogether, there were 391 participants, and again, these are longitudinal studies. They're actually accelerated longitudinal studies, for anyone who's interested, in which each participant is scanned at least twice as they grow up. And in total, across the 4 cohorts, across the 4 studies, there were 852 MRI scans that were in this analysis. So I'm going to show you a few of the results from these data. from these analyses. So the first is on cortical grey matter. That's what I just showed you for the social brain network, and this is cortical grey matter across the whole, averaged across the whole cortex. So now we're not focusing on individual regions, averaging across the whole cortex. The pattern looks really similar to the pattern I showed you for each individual region of the social brain network. This is cortical grey matter on the y-axis, plotted against age in years from 5 to 30 on the x-axis. And the different coloured lines correspond to the 4 cohorts. And I think the first thing to point out here is how remarkably similar the developmental trajectories are in these 4 different cohorts. They're completely independent cohorts living in different parts of the world. Their brains are developing in very similar ways. And that is, again, this trajectory that you've already seen, where grey matter volume is highest in late childhood and declines very substantially during adolescence, plateauing in the mid-20s. In fact, grey matter volume decreases by about 1.5% each year during the period of adolescence. Now, if you then look across the regions of the cortex, you do see some differences, and I'm just going to show you that now. So again, this is grey matter development, but here what I've plotted is grey matter thickness, cortical thickness, surface area, and volume up here in the 4 different lobes, so frontal cortex, parietal cortex, temporal cortex, and occipital cortex. And the main thing to notice here is that frontal, parietal, and temporal cortices are all doing something pretty similar, showing that very steep and protracted decline in volume and particularly in thickness. Volume, as you know, is a product of thickness and surface area, so that's not particularly surprising. The one region that doesn't show quite the same trajectory as the occipital cortex, the visual cortex, that does not change very substantially after about age 13, which is perhaps not surprising. It's a sensory region whereas these other 3 lobes are involved in higher level cognitive processes. Okay, so at the same time that grey matter is decreasing in adolescence, white matter volume is increasing. This is the same 4 cohort study showing cerebral white matter volume averaged across the whole brain. This is a significant linear increase in white matter across childhood and adolescence. And in fact, other studies have shown that that increase in white matter continues right into the 30s and even the 40s. Again, the similarity between these 4 different regions, 4 different cohorts is remarkable. This is a very robust, replicated pattern that we see. White matter increases by about 1% annually during adolescence. Okay, so you might be thinking, if you don't work in developmental cognitive neuroscience, which I'm assuming that most people here don't, what is going on? Why is grey matter decreasing so much, and why is white matter increasing during adolescence? And the answer is we don't really know why grey matter decreases and white matter increases, like what underlies those decreases as seen on MRI scans. And that's because although MRI scanning has completely revolutionized our understanding of brain development in humans, it doesn't yet have the resolution to tell us anything really about the brain at the level of the cell or the synapse. It is starting to, and I reckon in 20 years' time, or even 10 years' time, we will be able to use MRI to study the brain's microstructure at a much higher resolution. But right now we have to base our guesses about what underlies grey matter and white matter changes in the human brain on animal research and also research on post-mortem human brain tissue. Those studies have shown that at least three really important neurodevelopmental processes are happening throughout adolescence, and they might contribute to the changes in grey and white matter volumes during this time. So they are myelination and axonal growth. So I mentioned myelination already. So as you know, myelination of axons starts very early, but in utero in humans, and it continues in many regions of the brain right throughout childhood and adolescence, and even beyond that, as does axonal growth. So axons grow in diameter. Now, both of those developmental processes will result in increases in white matter and decreases and concomitant decreases in grey matter as viewed by MRI. So in other words, as axons become myelinated and grow in diameter, tissue becomes more white, and there's a concomitant decrease in grey matter. And that probably accounts for the majority of the decline in grey matter we see in human adolescence. There's another neurodevelopmental process that's also happening according to animal studies and post-mortem human brain tissue studies during adolescence, and that's synaptic pruning. So synapses become reorganized throughout development. The brain overproduces synapses through synaptogenesis, and those excess synapses then need to be eliminated in a process known as synaptic pruning, which we know in some brain regions happens during adolescence in humans, and that probably will result in a very small decrease in grey matter. So that might also contribute to the decline in grey matter that we see in MRI scanning. So these neurodevelopmental processes are all mechanisms that promote neuroplasticity, and that has contributed to the suggestion that adolescence represents a sensitive period of brain development, whereby the brain is particularly sensitive to changes in the environment, and that confers both opportunity for things like learning, but also vulnerability to stressful environmental events and perhaps to mental health problems. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about how the social brain and the brain more generally develops during adolescence. I'm now going to talk about social behavior. So one behavior that I've already mentioned or implied during adolescence is risk-taking. And risk-taking is a behavior that we immediately associate with adolescence, risk-taking and impulsivity. We worry about risks that adolescents take, and that's not surprising. We know that the leading cause of mortality in people aged between 10 and 24 years is accidents, mostly caused by risk-taking. Actually, I heard it must have been the radio or something today in the US, showing that the leading cause of mortality in young people, it was probably a little bit older than this, sort of 16 to 24, has just changed from road accidents to shooting accidents, I don't know what else to call them. That was reported in the US media today, which is quite eye-opening. But also, both of those things are often the consequence of risk-taking. Okay, so now, we worry about the risks that adolescents take because sometimes, like in the cases I've just told you about, risk-taking can go really wrong, it can result in accidents and sometimes even death. But it's not so simple as all adolescents take risks. In fact, lots of adolescents don't. There are huge individual differences in risk-taking. Some adolescents are very risk-averse. But also, risk-taking is not often a really bad thing. We need to take risks. Risk-taking is really important for learning and for exploring our environments. And finally, risk-taking in adolescence in particular seems to depend on the context. One context in which adolescents are much more likely to take risks is when they're with their friends, when they're with other people. So adolescents are more likely to take risks when they're with their friends. And there are many, many examples of this peer influence on risk-taking, both from the lab and also from real-life data. And I wanted to show you some data from the American Automobile Association Foundation. This is from 2017. This illustrates that. So what this graph shows is the percentage increase in death risk when young drivers under the age of 21 are carrying passengers in their car with them versus no passengers. So in other words, the percentage increase in having a fatal accident in young drivers if they're carrying passengers. And what you see down here is that carrying one passenger increases the risk of a fatal accident by about 40%, and then the risk of having a fatal accident increases exponentially with each additional passenger they have in the car with them. There's something about carrying passengers in the car which increases dangerous driving in young people. What the mechanism is more controversial, but there's something about being with other people that increases dangerous driving in young people. And actually, these kinds of data, plus lab data from people like Larry Steinberg's lab, have led to policy changes in countries like Canada and Australia, which now have policies such that young people are not allowed to carry non-family members in the car with them for a certain number of years after they've passed their test. Some insurance companies now offer reduced premiums for young people as long as they're not carrying passengers in their car. So we're really interested in this phenomenon, this social influence on adolescent behaviour and adolescent decision-making. I'm going to show you a couple of studies that we've done on that behaviourally. So the first study, which was led by my former postdoc, Lisa Knoll, looks at social influence on risk perception. So in this study, we tested 563 participants, about half of whom were female, half male, age between 8 to 59 years. So in this study, it's very straightforward. You're presented with various different scenarios that carry a certain risk that you might associate certain risk with them. So things like crossing a street on a red light. Other scenarios were things like cycling without a helmet, driving without a seatbelt. You're then asked, there are many, many risky scenarios, you're then asked to rate how risky you think this scenario is by using a mouse on an analog scale. And then you're told all the teenagers who've taken part in this study so far, that hundreds of teenagers, this is their average risk rating for that same scenario. So this is a provided rating provided by teenagers. In fact, that's just a cover story. It was, in fact, randomly generated by us, by the computer. But participants didn't know that. They thought they were seeing real risk ratings from teenagers, and in a different condition, they were told that this is the average risk rating of adults for the same scenario. And then they were asked to rate how risky they thought this scenario was. Again, all that information goes off the screen and they rate again. And what we're really interested in is whether people change their risk rating from time 1 to time 2 in the direction of the provided rating. That would be an indication of social influence on risk perception. But what is we knew that would happen because there's 50 years of social psychology showing that we are very influenced by other people. What we're really interested in this study was whether people are more influenced by adults' risk ratings than by teenagers' risk ratings. So do they change their ratings more in line with adults' provided ratings than teenagers' provided ratings? And that's what I'm going to show you in the next graph. Okay, so in this graph, what you're seeing is the participants who took part in our study down here on the x-axis. This is the participants, that's their age, 8 to 11, the children, 12 to 14, young adolescents, 15 to 18, mid-adolescents, and then we had a group of young adults and a group of adults. This is what this, on the y-axis, is the difference between their influence by adults versus their influence by teenagers. So if they're more influenced by adults than by teenagers, then the bar will be below the 0 line. That's what we hypothesized, and that's what we found for 3 groups. The children and the 2 adult groups were both more influenced by adults' perception of risk than by teenagers' perception of risk. The mid-adolescents showed no difference between the 2. They were equally influenced by both adults and teenagers. And the young adolescents, aged 12 to 14, showed the reverse effect. They were more influenced by teenagers than by adults. So in other words, young adolescents aged 12 to 14, risk perception is influenced more by people their own age, by other teenagers, than it is by adults. And we replicated this effect in another study. So this effect here has been demonstrated in 2 independent samples of the same age range, 563, that's the data you see here, and another group of 590 participants that we published a couple of years later. So that does seem like a robust effect. Now, why is it that young people are so influenced by each other? One of our hypotheses is that maybe young people want to kind of go along with their peer group because they really don't want to be excluded by their peer group. That's really important to young people, to be included in their group and not be ostracized. And we did a study looking at that hypothesis. This is really quite a long time ago now. This was a study run by Kat Sebastian, who was a PhD student with me, many years ago. She now heads up the mental health research at the Wellcome Trust, which is a big medical research charity in the UK, but it gives funding around the world. So in this study, we wanted to look at how participants respond to being socially excluded, and we used the Cyberball game. Some of you may know that game. This is an online game of catch. It's a ball tossing game where you're told that you're this participant down here. You're playing a game of catch with these 2 other people over the internet, and they're going to throw a ball to you. You can throw it back to either one of them, and this will go on for a couple of minutes. Now, in fact, that's a cover story. We program these little characters either to include you in their game of catch or to exclude you, and I'm just going to show you what that looks like, the exclusion condition. So you get thrown the ball, you can choose who to throw it back to, and then they could throw it back to you, but in this case they don't. They just continue to play with each other, and they leave you out of their ball game for 2 minutes. And that's very sad. And adults, this paradigm has been used many times with adults, that being socially excluded, even in this very basic virtual game of catch, leads to lower mood and increased anxiety in adults. So we wanted to know how adolescents respond to this kind of social exclusion. This is some of the data from that study. This is mood, so just mood measured by a standard mood questionnaire. And this is a group of adults that we tested, so I'm showing the adult data first. In yellow, this is adults' mood at baseline, so before they took part in this study. This is the green bar is their mood after being included in that game of catch. That's, by the way, not a significant increase in mood, and what that suggests is that adults expect to be included. It doesn't increase their mood to be included, but there's a significant drop in mood if they're excluded in that game. We also included a group of young adolescents and a group of mid-adolescents, and they show exactly the same pattern of mood as adults do, but the difference is that their drop in mood after exclusion is significantly greater than the drop in mood after exclusion in adults. And what that suggests is that adolescents, both young and mid-adolescents, are hypersensitive to social exclusion. And the same was true for anxiety. The increase in anxiety after being excluded was greater in the adolescent groups, particularly the young adolescents, than in the adults. Now, when you think about this, so adolescents are hypersensitive to being socially excluded. It doesn't make them feel good at all. It doesn't make any of us feel good, but they're particularly affected by social exclusion. What would that mean for adolescent decision-making? Well, it might mean that they're very motivated to avoid that, to avoid being socially excluded. And the way to do that is to avoid social risk, to avoid the risk of being socially excluded. I'm going to illustrate that with this example of smoking, but it could apply to other things that we worry about young people doing, like binge drinking or experimenting with drugs or dangerous driving. So, a question that people often ask is, why do very intelligent, educated young people nevertheless make these decisions like starting to smoke or taking drugs or whatever? But if you think about, say, a 13-year-old girl who is out with her friends and they're all smoking cigarettes and they offer her a cigarette, well, what's more risky for her? To say yes to a cigarette knowing that it carries health risks, or to say no to a cigarette knowing that that could result in her being excluded by her social group? Well, we would argue that for an adolescent who needs to be motivated to avoid social exclusion, avoiding social risk might matter more to them than avoiding other types of risk, like health risks or legal risks. That's not to condone those kinds of decisions, but it sheds those decisions in a more rational light. And in fact, in a way of thinking about this is I've been talking about these stereotypes of teenagers. They take risks, they're really impulsive. Actually, in some ways, they're very risk averse, but they're socially risk averse, which sometimes results in increases in health and legal risk taking. Now, it's not just risk-taking where adolescents show a higher propensity for influence. We also are interested in other kinds of behaviour, like, for example, prosocial behaviour and prosocial influence in adolescence. This, I'm just going to illustrate it with one study that was carried out fairly recently by my postdoc, Gabriela Cerchia, where he looked at prosocial influence on charity donations. So he comes from a background of economics, and one problem that economists, there might be some here, have with our psychology experiments is they really don't like deception in them, and they really don't like them to be hypothetical. So he wanted to do a study that wasn't on hypothetical charity donations, but was on actual charity donations. So in this study, we included 222 people, again about half female, half male, aged between 11 and 35. It's exactly the same kind of paradigm as the one I just showed you on risk perception, but in this case it's about charity donations. Participants come into the lab, they're given a certain amount of money, sort of tokens, but which will translate into real money, and they're told on every trial you can give away some, you don't have to give away any of this money, but you can give away some of your money to charity. So we had a whole bunch of different charities, like climate change charities, but we also had animal charities, children charities, all sorts of things. And we asked them how much of you, they have an endowment of 50 points or whatever, but that will translate into money, and it does. And they're asked, how much of your money do you want to donate to this charity? Between 0 and 50. And then they're told, okay, you donated, in this case, 25. All the teenagers who've taken part in this study so far, this is how much they have donated to this charity. Do you want to change your donation? And there was also another condition where they were shown purported adult donations. So it's very similar to the risk perception study, but in this case it was about charitable giving. We also manipulated whether the observed donations here were either more pro-social, so in other words, higher than the participant's first donation, as is the case here, or more selfish, in other words, lower than the participant's first donation. And in the next couple of graphs, I'm going to focus on that result. So whether when you see other people donating more than you or less than you, whether that affects how much you change your donation. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you the probability of being influenced. And like we showed with our risk perception study, we found that young adolescents are more likely to be pro-socially influenced in their charity giving. So these graphs have 3 different age groups in them: young adolescents, aged 11 to 14, mid-adolescents, aged 15 to 18, and adults aged 23 to 35 years. So this is the probability of being influenced in the pro-social condition. That is the condition where the observed donation is higher than the donation that than participants' first donation. So you give something and then you see that other people are giving more than you. We're looking at the probability of you changing your donation in a more pro-social direction, so giving more on your second donation. The young adolescents were significantly more pro-socially influenced than were the adults in the pro-social condition, but not in the selfish condition. In that case, there was no difference. The second result from this analysis was that adults showed what is called opportunistic conformity, and that is this effect here. And it's not a very nice effect. It's the effect that adults are more likely to be influenced by other people's selfish donations than other people's pro-social donations. In other words, in the selfish condition, adults take the opportunity to lower their donation on the second when they get to change it, but they don't do the equivalent in the pro-social, or they do the equivalent in the pro-social condition less. So they're more likely to be selfishly influenced than pro-socially influenced. We showed that again when we looked at magnitude of change. So this is how much people changed their donation. Adults also show this opportunistic conformity effect in the magnitude of their social influence. I'm going to show you this is the magnitude of change of donations, how much you change your donation. I'm going to show you the 2 adolescent groups first. So these are the 2 adolescent groups. This is how much they changed their donations in the selfish condition in pink and the pro-social condition in blue. There's no significant difference between those 2 conditions. They're equally, they changed their donations to a more or less equal extent in those 2 different conditions. The adults, however, show a very significant difference between the selfish condition and the pro-social condition. They change their donations much more in the selfish direction when they see other people giving less than them than they do in the pro-social direction when they see other people giving more than them. So us adults, we like to take the opportunity to be meaner, to be more selfish when other people are giving less than us. And that seems to be something that isn't developed yet. That opportunistic conformity isn't developed yet in adolescence. We don't know why. That's something that we're really interested in now, but there could be various different mechanisms. Okay, so the implications of this research for education and for public health, I think, are that young people are really influenced by each other, and that could be capitalized upon more in interventions in schools and in public health. So there are now, recently, a few studies showing that peer-led interventions are quite successful in young people. So I'll give you one example that was carried out by Palak and colleagues a few years ago, looking at a randomized peer-led anti-bullying intervention in 56 middle schools in the US. So they took 56 middle schools, divided them randomly into two groups. In one group, they carried out their anti-bullying campaigns as normal, led by teachers. And in the other half of the schools, a select group of students in the schools were educated about the harmful effects of bullying and social exclusion, and then they were incentivized to run their own campaigns. And in those schools where the young people themselves led the anti-bullying campaigns, student conflict was reduced by about 25% over the ensuing year, compared to the schools in which, the control schools in which the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the teachers. And that effect was stronger when the students leading the campaigns were more highly connected. So in other words, young people really have the potential to influence each other. And I think we don't capitalize upon that. We don't empower young people to influence each other enough, when it actually could be quite a successful way of encouraging young people to make positive, healthy decisions. Okay, so all this research showing that social brain and social behavior changes really substantially during adolescence suggests that adolescence might be a sensitive period of social development, and that has been proposed recently. Now, there's not much research on sensitive periods or critical periods in humans. It's really difficult to do those experimental studies for ethical reasons, but there are many, many studies in animals, particularly in rodents, showing that adolescence is indeed a sensitive period for social experience. This is just one example from a study carried out from the 1970s in the department where I now work in Cambridge, but it's been replicated many times in rats in this case, but also in mice, showing that the general finding is that if you socially isolate adolescent rats, so rats go through about 35 days of adolescence, if you socially isolate them in their period of adolescence, that has unique and arguably more detrimental effects on behavior and brain development compared with the same kinds of isolation pre-puberty or in adulthood. So animal research suggests that there's something about adolescence, the period of adolescence, which requires social interaction in order for the brain and behavior to develop along its kind of normal and optimal path. Now, we have become really interested in that, the effects of social isolation and the effects of loneliness in human adolescence. This is Livia Tomova. She was a postdoc at MIT. About 3 years ago, she applied for a research fellowship to come and work with me, looking at social isolation and loneliness in human adolescents, together with our colleague at Cambridge, Amy Orban. So based on the idea that adolescence is a sensitive period of social interaction and that social isolation is really not very good for adolescents in particular, and the fact that there was this large survey carried out in the UK, by the way, this is all pre-pandemic, showing that, to everyone's surprise, 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK reported the highest loneliness levels. So I think the prediction was probably that elderly people who live alone would report the highest loneliness levels. In a way, that was why this big BBC survey was carried out in the first place. But it wasn't the elderly people who showed the highest loneliness levels, it was young people. Which is perhaps surprising, given that young people are highly connected, they're highly motivated to be social, they're connected online as well as in person. So we started planning a study, an experimental study, looking at the effects of social isolation and loneliness on young people's brain and behavior. That was in 2019. Olivia had got her fellowship to come to work in Cambridge. We were applying for ethics. We were applying for funding to do this study, and then the pandemic hit, which in a way was really annoying because it meant our whole study had to be, substantially delayed. We couldn't do this study because everyone was at home and no one was doing any in-person science. But it was also kind of poignant because it was, it emphasized the real need to understand how loneliness affects young people's development and their mental health, because everyone was in lockdown and at home and the schools were closed, and study after study was showing that lockdown loneliness was really high, and particularly in young people. There's been many studies now, these are just UK studies, but I know there are lots of studies in the US as well showing that loneliness has increased during the pandemic. 1 in 10 adolescents in England, in a very big NHS survey last year, reported always or often feeling lonely in 2021. Mental health problems have also increased. So in this big NHS survey last year, they found that 1 in 6 adolescents in the UK had a probable mental health condition in 2021. That compared with 1 in 9 in 2017. 1 in 9 was already a huge increase on the previous 10 years. So this is a big crisis. So we are currently looking at the effects of social isolation on adolescent brain behaviour and mental health. I'm not going to talk about that today. We've finished the study now, but we're still analysing the data. But what I am going to talk about in my last couple of slides looks at social media, because one of our hypotheses was that digital means of social connection might mitigate the harmful effects of social isolation. Young people still had, or we all had, the means to connect with friends on our phones, on social media, and maybe that mitigated any harmful effect or some of the harmful effects of being socially isolated. Now that kind of goes against this general feeling that you read about all the time in newspapers and in the media, that social media is somehow really bad for young people's mental health. You read it all the time. In fact, there have been quite a few studies, some of which have been carried out by Amy Orban, who I've already introduced, looking at the relationship between social media and mental health in adolescence. Those studies tend to show a correlation between social media use and adolescent mental health. It's very, very small, the correlation. It's negative, so the more social media you use, the lower mental health you have. But it's also bidirectional, and I'll just show you an example of that. So this is a finding from a study carried out by Amy Orban and her colleagues a couple of years ago in 12,000 or over 12,000 10 to 15-year-olds from the UK Understanding Society data set. What she showed is that social media use leads to lower life satisfaction. So higher than average social media use in 1 year predicted a small decrease in life satisfaction 1 year later, but the reverse was also true. So lower than average life satisfaction in 1 year predicted a small increase in social media use 1 year later. So in other words, there are these bidirectional effects. It's not surprising if you're feeling really low, then you might resort to your phone and social media more than going out and engaging in the world. Now, what we really became interested in is whether there are windows of developmental sensitivity to social media. That was not something that had been looked at before. So in other words, how does this relationship between social media use and life satisfaction vary both across age but also across gender? So we were focusing on adolescents because we know that adolescents are the biggest users of social media. They're very motivated to connect with their friends and not to be socially excluded by their peer groups. They also show vulnerability to mental health problems. So we thought if any developmental period is going to be sensitive to social media use, it's going to be adolescence. And that's what we did this study on. I'm just going to show you one of the main findings from this study, which was just published about 2 weeks ago. Okay, so we were looking at the longitudinal relationship between social media use and life satisfaction. We were looking at how social media use in 1 year predicts life satisfaction the following year in almost 17,500 participants aged between 10 and 21. There were 9 testing waves across that period, approximately annually. This again is from the UK Understanding Society dataset. Okay, so this is, again, it's longitudinal. Social media use in 1 year predicting life satisfaction the following year. And it's all self-reported, by the way. Okay, so I'm going to show you the data. This is for males. What you see here is how social media use in 1 year predicts life satisfaction the following year, and on the x-axis is age from 10 to 21. Now, most of the time during this age period, the relationship is almost zero. It's very, very close to the zero line here. However, there are 2 periods during this period of adolescence when the relationship becomes significantly negative, and that is for males at age 14 to 15, and again at age 19. So in other words, at these 2 time points, the relationship between social media use and life satisfaction becomes negative. The more social media you use in 1 year, the lower your life satisfaction tends to be the following year. And that happens for boys 14 to 15, and again at age 19. The girls showed the same pattern, but there was a significant difference in early adolescence. So the females showed, again, this significant negative relationship between social media use 1 year and life satisfaction the following year, but it was earlier than boys, so age between 11 to 13 years in girls. But there was no difference in late adolescence. Again, they showed this negative relationship at age 19. So what this suggests is that there are some points in adolescence where this relationship between social media use and well-being becomes negative, something to be concerned about. We don't know why. We speculated that perhaps this first early adolescent sort of dip, negative relationship, might be something to do with puberty. We know that puberty occurs a couple of years earlier in girls than in boys, so that would fit with the difference in timings. And puberty, of course, comes with puberty are all sorts of increases in stresses, like you change physically, your view of yourself changes, other people's view of you changes, you become more concerned with other people's views. So perhaps that's something to do with puberty. That's something we're really interested in looking at now. And then this decrease in this relationship at age 19 might be something completely different, a more social explanation, like becoming independent for the first time. Most young people leave home at around age 18 or 19 in the UK, and this is the first time where they have to create new social networks, and that brings with it lots of different pressures. Okay, so just to summarize my talk, the social brain develops throughout adolescence, as does most of the cortex. Social risk avoidance is an important determinant of adolescent typical behavior. Adolescence might be a sensitive period of brain development, conferring both vulnerability to things like dangerous risk-taking and mental health problems, but also opportunity for things like interventions. We are currently looking at and are very interested in how the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns and social distancing are affecting young people, in particular their loneliness. And I've just talked about the developmental effects on the influence of social media use and life satisfaction in adolescence. So thank you for listening. Thank you to my research group and to my funding.
Thank you for that. That was really good.